Well, it looks like we're going to start chapter 27 with an apology, probably, for the sounds of the lawnmower going outside my window. This is part of the twice weekly regiment of the church across the street, where they don't believe in anything but straight, clean lines of pure monoculture grass, and are currently spraying a sluice of green stained water across everything parked along the street. So that's fun. We still have a happy riot of color of lilacs and violets and dandelions on our side of the street. So that's where we are. But in our story, we're about to begin chapter 27, where Huck has hived the full $6,000 from the colonel, and no, not the colonel, the king and the duke, the fake king and duke, who've stolen it, sort of, from the poor, orphaned young girls. That's where we are. Chapter 27. I crept to their doors and listened. They was snoring. So I tiptoed along and got downstairs all right. There weren't a sound anywheres. I peeped through a crack in the dining room door and see the men that was watching the corpse all sound asleep in their chairs. The door was open in the parlor where the corpse was laying, and there was a candle in both rooms. I passed along, and the parlor door was open, but I see there weren't nobody in there but the remainders of Peter. So I shoved on by, but the front door was locked, and the key wasn't there. Just then I heard somebody coming down the stairs, back behind me. I run into the parlor, and took a swift look around, and the only place I could see to hide, the bag, was in the coffin. The lid was shoved along about a foot, showing the dead man's face down in there, the wet cloth over it, and his shroud on. Well, I tucked the money bag in under the lid, just down beyond where his hands was crossed, which made me creep, as they was so cold. And then I run back across the room and hid behind the door. The person coming was Mary Jane. She went to the coffin, very soft, and kneeled down and looked in. And then she put up her handkerchief. I could see she begun to cry, but I couldn't hear her, and her back was to me. I slid out, and as I passed the dining room, I thought I'd make sure them watchers hadn't seen me. So I looked through the crack, and everything was all right. They hadn't stirred. I slipped up to bed, feeling rather blue on accounts of the thing playing out the way after I had took so much trouble and run so much risk about it. Says I, if it could stay where it is, all right. Because when we get down the river 100 mile or two, I could write back to Mary Jane. She could dig him up again and get it. But that ain't the thing that's going to happen. The thing that's going to happen is the money will be found when they come to screw the lid on. And then the king will get it again. And it'll be just a long day before he gives anybody another chance to smouch it from him again. Of course, I wanted to slide down and get it out of there, but I dasn't try it. Every minute was getting earlier now. Pretty soon some of them watchers would begin to stir, and I might get catched. Catched with $6,000 in my hands that nobody hadn't hired me to take care of. I don't wish to be mixed up in such business as that, says I to myself. When I got downstairs in the morning, the parlor was shut, and the watchers was gone. There warn't nobody around but the family and the widow Bartley and our tribe. I watched their faces to see if anything was happening, but I couldn't tell. Towards the middle of the day, the undertaker come with his man, and they set the coffin in the middle of the room on a couple of chairs, and then set all our chairs in rows, borrowed more from the neighbors till the hall and the parlor and the dining room was full. I see the coffin lid was the way it was before, but I dasn't go look in or under it with folks around. Then people begun to flock in, and the beats and the girls took the seats in the front row at the head of the coffin. For half an hour people filed round slow and single rank, and looked down at the dead man's face a minute, and some dropped in a tear, and it was all very still and solemn, one of the girls and the beats holding the handkerchiefs to their eyes, and keeping their heads bent and sobbing a little. There weren't no other sound but the scraping of feet on the floor and the blowing of noses, 'cause people always blows them more at a funeral than they do at any other places, except in a church. When the place was packed full, the undertaker, he slid around with his black gloves and his soft, smoothing, southern ways, putting on the last touches and getting people and all things ship-shape and comfortable, and making no more sound than a cat. He never spoke. He moved people around. He squeezed in the late ones. He opened up passageways, and he done it with nods and signs with his hands. And then he took his place over against the wall. He was the softest, glidingest, stealthiest man I ever did see. And there weren't no more smile to him than there is to a ham. They had borrowed a melodeon, a sick one, and when everything was ready, a young woman sat down and worked it. And it was pretty squeaky and colicky, and everybody joined in and sung, and Peter was the only one that had a good thing that time, according to my notion. And then the Reverend Hobson opened up, slow and solemn, and begun to talk. And straight off, the most outrageous row busted out in the cellar a body ever heard. It was only one dog, but he made a most powerful racket, and he kept it all right along. And the parson, he had to stand there over the coffin and wait. You couldn't hear yourself think. It was downright awkward, and nobody didn't seem to know what to do. But pretty soon we see that long-legged undertaker make a sign to the preacher as much as to say, "Don't worry, just depend on me." And then he stooped down and began to glide along the wall, just his shoulders showing over the people's head. So he glided along, and the powwow and the racket getting more and more outrageous all the time. And at last, when he'd gone down 2 sides of the room, he disappears down the cellar. Then in about 2 seconds we heard a whack, and the dog, he finished up with the most amazing howl or two, and then everything was dead still. And the parson begun his solemn talk where he'd left off. In a minute or two, here comes this undertaker's back and shoulders, gliding along the wall again. And so he glided and glided around 3 sides of the room, and then rose up, shaded his mouth with his hands, and stretched his neck out over towards the preacher and says, over the people's heads, and whispers in kind of a hoarse whisper, "He had a rat." And then he drooped down and glided along the wall and again to his place. You could see it was a great satisfaction to the people, because naturally they wanted to know. A little thing like that don't cost nothing, and it's just the little things that makes up a man be looked up to and liked. There weren't no popular man in town than what that undertaker was. Well, the funeral sermon was very good, but p'ison long and tiresome. And then the king, he shoved in and got off some of his usual rubbish, and at last the job was through. And the undertaker begun to sneak up on the coffin with his screwdriver. I was in a sweat then, and I watched him pretty keen. But he never meddled at all, just slid the lid along as soft as mush, and screwed it down tight and fast. So there I was. I didn't know whether the money was in there or not. So says I, suppose somebody's hogged that bag on the sly. Now how do I know whether to write Mary Jane or not? Suppose she dug him up and found nothing. What would she think of me then? Blame it, I says. I might get hunted up and jailed. I better lay low and keep dark, and not write it at all. The thing's awful mixed up now. Trying to better it, I've worsened it 100 times. I wish to goodness I'd just left it alone. I'd fetched the whole business. They buried him. We come back home. I went to watching faces again. I couldn't help it. I couldn't rest easy. But nothing come of it. The faces didn't tell me nothing. The king, he visited around in the evening and sweetened everybody up and made himself ever so friendly. And he'd give out the idea that his congregation over in England would be in a sweat about him, so he must hurry up and settle the estate right away and leave for home. He was so very sorry that everyone was so pushed. And so was everybody. They wished he could stay longer, but they said they could see it couldn't be done. And he said, of course, him and William would take the girls home with him. And that pleased everybody too. because then the girls would be well fixed and amongst their own relations. And it pleased the girls, too, tickled them so they clean forgot they'd ever had a trouble in the world, and told him to sell out as quick as he wanted to. They would be ready. Them poor things was that glad and happy it made my heart ache to see them getting fooled and lied to so. But I didn't see no safe way for me to chip in and change the general tune. Well, blamed if the king didn't build the house and the black folk and all the property for auction straight off. Sale 2 days after the funeral. But anybody could buy private beforehand if they wanted to. So the next day, after the funeral, along about noontime, the girls' joy got the first jolt. A couple of traders come along, and the king sold them all the black folk reasonable, for 3-day drafts, as they's called. And away they went, 2 sons up the river to Memphis, their mother down the river to Orleans. I thought them poor girls and them black folk would break their hearts for grief. They cried around each other. It took on so it made me most sick down to see it. The girls said they hadn't ever dreamed of seeing the family separated or sold away from the town. I can't ever get it out of my memory. The sight of them poor miserable girls and them black folk hanging around each other's necks and crying. I reckon I couldn't have stood it at all, and would have had to bust out and tell on our gang if I had known that the sale weren't no count, and that everybody would be back home in a week or two. The thing made a big stir in town, too, and a good many come out flat-footed and said it was scandalous to separate the mother and the children that way. It injured the fraud some, but the old fool he bulled right along, in spite of all the Duke could say or do. And I tell you, the Duke was getting powerful uneasy. Next day of the auction day, about broad day in the morning, the king and the Duke come up in the garret and woke me up, and I see by their look there was some trouble. And the king says, "Was you in my room night before last?" "No, your majesty," which is the way I always called him when nobody wrong but when there weren't nobody around but our gang. "Was you in there yesterday or last night?" "No, your majesty." "Honor bright now, no lies." "Honor bright, your majesty. I'm telling the truth. I ain't been a near your room since Miss Mary Jane took you in and the Duke and showed it to you." The Duke says, "Have you seen anybody else go in there?" "No, your grace, none as I remember, I believe." "Well, stop and think." Well, I studied a while, and I see my chance. And then I says, "I did see the black folk go in there several times." Both of them gave a little jump, and it looked like they hadn't ever expected it. And then, like they had expected it. Then the Duke says, "What, all of them?" "Well, no. Leastways not all at once. That is, I don't think I ever seen them all come in and out at once. Just the one time." "Well, hello, when was that?" "Well, it was the day we had the funeral in the morning. It weren't early, because I had overslept. And I was starting down the ladder, and I see him." "Well, go on, go on. What did they do? How did they act?" "Well, they didn't do nothing. And they didn't act any way much, as far as I could see. They tiptoed away, so I seen easy enough that they shoved in there to do something to your majesty's room, or something, supposing you was up, and then found you weren't up, so they was kind of hoping to slide out of the way of trouble without waking you up, if they hadn't already waked you up." "Well, great guns, this is a go," says the king, and both of them looked pretty sick and tolerable silly. They stood there a-thinking and scratching their heads a minute, but the Duke he bust out into a raspy little chuckle and says, "It does beat now on the neat how the black folks play their hand. They led on to be sorry they was going out of this region. And I believe they was sorry, too. And so did you, and everybody. But don't tell me anymore that the black folk ain't got no histrionic talent. Why, the way they played that thing, it would be a fool to anybody. In my opinion, there's a fortune in them. If I had a capital and a theater, I wouldn't want a better layout than that. And here we've gone and sold them for a song. Yes, ain't privileged to sing the song yet. I say, where is that song, that draft? In the bank, to be collected. Where would it be? Well, that's all right then, thank goodness. Says I, all timid-like. Is something wrong? Well, the king, he whirls on me and rips out, none of your business. You keep your head shut. And mind your own affairs, if you got any. Long as you're in this town, don't you forget that. You hear? And then he says to the Duke, We just got to swaller it and say nothing. Mum's the word for us. As they were starting down the ladder, the Duke, he chuckles again and says, Quick sales and small profits. It's a good business, yes. The king snarls around on him and says, I was trying to do for the best in selling them out so quick. If the profits was turned out to be none, lacking considerable, and none to carry, is it my fault any more than it's yourn? Well, they'd be in this house yet if we wouldn't have gotten habity but doobity. Well, they'd be in this house yet, and we wouldn't if I'd gotten to my advice listened to. The king sassed back as much as was safe for him, and then swapped around and lit into me again. He give me down the banks for not coming and telling him that I see the black folk come out of his room acting that way. Said any fool would have knowed something was up. And then he waltzed in and cussed himself for a while. Said that all of it come to him not laying late and taking his natural rest that morning. And if he'd been blamed if he'd ever do it again. So they went off with John, and I felt dreadful glad I'd worked it out so it all come off onto the black folk, and yet none of the black folk could come to no harm by it.